Listen to me closely. The champagne was flowing, the music was loud enough to rattle the windows, and the room was filled with suits that cost more than my first car. I stood there near the back, clutching the cheap plastic cup my son-in-law had shoved into my hand, watching him laugh with the big shots. I was holding my old, scratched-up safety goggles, a little memento I'd carried in my pocket for 35 years of service. That's when I heard it, clear as a bell over the clatter of silverware and the fake laughter. Him? Oh, don't worry about him. He's nobody important, just the help, basically. My own son-in-law, Mark, the man who lived under a roof I paid for, driving a luxury sedan I co-signed for. He looked right through me like I was invisible, like 30 years of busting my knuckles at this company meant absolutely nothing. He thought I was just a washed-up old man ready for the pasture, a relic to be discarded. But he didn't see the man standing behind him. He didn't know that the CEO wasn't just my boss. He was the man whose life I saved in '98. Mark thought he was climbing the ladder, but folks, he was about to step on a landmine. You need to see how this ends. Stick around. You have to understand something about men like Frank before you can truly understand the level of betrayal we are dealing with here, because Frank wasn't just a worker, he was the kind of man who built this country with his bare hands, the salt of the earth type, who didn't know the meaning of a sick day and who viewed a 40-hour work week as a vacation because for 35 years, Frank punched the clock at Anderson Manufacturing before the sun came up, and he didn't clock out until his muscles were screaming and his boots were heavy with the grime of the shop floor. He was a machinist, a master of his craft who could listen to the hum of a turbine and tell you exactly which bearing was loose. Within 3 seconds, he had grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly remove, and he wore that stain like a badge of honor because that grease paid for the mortgage on the little three-bedroom ranch house on Elm Street, and it paid for the braces on his daughter Sarah's teeth, and it put food on the table every single night without fail. He was a man of sweat equity who believed that if you gave a company your loyalty, they would give you respect in return. And for a long time, that equation seemed to work. He didn't ask for much, just a fair wage, and the promise of a pension that would let him and his wife Martha retire in peace, maybe buy a little fishing boat and watch the sunsets. But life has a funny way of throwing a wrench in the gears, doesn't it, folks? Because Martha passed away 6 years ago, leaving Frank with a hole in his heart the size of the Grand Canyon and a house that suddenly felt way too quiet and way too big for one man, but he kept working. He threw himself into the job with a ferocity that scared the younger guys because work was the only thing that kept the memories at bay and the only thing that kept him moving forward. For Sarah, his pride and joy, the little girl who used to run to the door when he came home, smelling of oil and steel, was all grown up now, and she had brought someone new into the picture, a man named Mark, who was everything Frank was not. Mark was a man of soft hands and expensive tastes, a guy who thought manual labor was something you hired people to do while you sat in an air-conditioned office and moved numbers around on a screen. And right from the start, Frank had a bad feeling about him, a feeling in his gut like he had swallowed a stone, because Mark had that slick way of talking where he used a lot of words but didn't actually say anything of substance. He was all flash and no foundation, a snake in the grass waiting for the right moment to strike. But Frank bit his tongue because he saw how Sarah looked at him with stars in her eyes, and Frank loved his daughter more than he loved his own life, so he welcomed Mark into the family. He shook his hand even though it felt like gripping a dead fish, and he paid for the wedding that cost more than Frank made in a year, dipping into the nest egg that he and Martha had spent decades building penny by penny, sacrifice by sacrifice, just to see his little girl smile. You might think the old man is weak because he loves them and lets them walk all over him, but trust me, you're looking at a sleeping lion, and when he wakes up, it's going to be terrifying. So the years went by, and Mark floated from job to job, always having some excuse for why it didn't work out. It was always the boss's fault, or the market was down, or his genius wasn't being recognized, and meanwhile Frank was still grinding away at the factory, picking up overtime shifts whenever he could because Sarah and Mark were always a little short on rent, or they needed a new car because the old one wasn't projecting the right image for Mark's career, and Frank would just nod and write the check because that's what fathers do. They provide, they protect, they play the long game, hoping that one day the kid will stand on his own 2 feet. But Mark wasn't interested in standing, he was interested in climbing, and he realized that the easiest ladder to climb was the one Frank had already built. So about 5 years ago, Mark came to Frank with a sob story about how he couldn't catch a break and he needed an in at a solid company, and he asked Frank if he could put in a good word at Anderson Manufacturing. Now, Frank knew the floor wasn't for Mark, but there were openings in the corporate sales division, and Frank had a reputation at that plant. He was a legend, a man who had been there since the doors opened, and when Frank spoke, people listened. So he went to the floor manager and he went to HR, and he cashed in decades of goodwill to get his son-in-law an interview. And because of Frank's name, Mark got the job. He walked into a salary that took Frank 20 years to earn. And did he say thank you? Did he show a shred of gratitude? Not really. He just acted like it was his birthright, like he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and the world owed him a living. And at first, Frank tried to be happy for him, thinking maybe this would stabilize the family. Maybe Sarah wouldn't look so stressed all the time. But as Mark settled into the role, he started to change, or maybe he just stopped pretending because the suit and the title went straight to his head and he started treating Frank not as the man who opened the door for him, but as an embarrassment, a reminder of where he came from. He would walk through the factory floor with the other executives and look right past Frank, who was covered in sweat and grime fixing a jam on the assembly line, and Frank would see him. He would see the way Mark smirked at the other suits, the way he made a show of checking his watch, while good men were busting their backs to make the product that paid his commission. It was a sticker shock to the soul for Frank to see such arrogance up close, but he kept his head down and did his job because that's what professionals do. This is where most fathers would crack, where they would grab that boy by the collar and teach him a lesson in respect. But this man, he's playing the long game, so watch this. The dynamic shifted even more when Frank's health took a little dip. Nothing major, just the wear and tear of a lifetime of hard labor, a bad back, and some arthritis in the knees. And Mark used that as leverage to suggest that maybe Frank should sell his house and move into the in-law suite at Mark and Sarah's new place, a place that Frank's money helped buy, mostly because Mark claimed he wanted to take care of Frank, but really, Frank knew it was because Mark wanted the equity from Frank's house to fund some new investment scheme. But Frank, being the man he has thought about being close to Sarah, thought about maybe having breakfast with his grandkids if they ever came along, and he agreed. He sold the house he built with Martha, the house where every scratch on the floorboards had a story, and he moved into the basement of Mark's McMansion. And that's when the real nightmare began, because once Frank was under Mark's roof, the power dynamic flipped completely. Frank wasn't the provider anymore in Mark's eyes. He was a freeloader, a moocher, an old man taking up space and eating their food, even though Frank turned over a chunk of his pension every month for expenses. Mark started making little comments at the dinner table about how much electricity Frank used, or how he coughed too loud at night, or how his old truck looked like a junk heap in the driveway of their pristine suburban neighborhood. It was a slow invasion of dignity, 1,000 little cuts designed to bleed Frank of his self-respect and make him feel small, and the worst part was seeing Sarah caught in the middle. She would look at her father with sad, apologetic eyes, but she wouldn't stand up to Mark. She was too afraid of rocking the boat, too afraid of his temper, so she stayed silent, and that silence hurt Frank more than Mark's insults ever could, because he raised her to be strong, but he saw that she was trapped, just like he was trapped in that basement surrounded by boxes of his life that he wasn't allowed to unpack because Mark said they were clutter. And so Frank spent his evenings sitting in the dark, polishing his tools, looking at the one photo of Martha he kept on the nightstand, and whispering to her that he was trying his best to keep the peace. But the pressure was building, folks. It was building like steam in a boiler with a blocked valve. And you know what happens when the pressure gets too high? Eventually something has to blow. And the catalyst for that explosion was the retirement party. the company announced that Frank was finally hanging up his hard hat after 35 years, and because he was such a fixture at the plant, the management decided to throw a real shindig, not just a cake in the break room, but a proper evening event at a banquet hall with the executives and the board members. And Mark, hearing this, saw an opportunity not to honor his father-in-law, but to network, to schmooze, to climb that ladder a little higher, using Frank's milestone as a stepping stone for his own ambition. He told Frank, "Don't worry, old man. I'll handle the arrangements. I'll make sure it's classy." But the way he said it with that sneer made Frank's skin crawl, because he knew Mark didn't care about the 35 years of sweat equity. He only cared about who was going to be in the room and what he could get out of them. So the night of the party arrived, and Frank put on his one good suit, the one he wore to funerals and weddings, a little tight around the shoulders now, but still dignified, and he looked in the mirror and saw a man who had given everything for his family, and he wondered if tonight would be the night they finally showed him some respect. He wondered if Mark would finally say, "Thank you," publicly, but deep down he knew better. He knew there was a snake in the grass, and he knew he had to be ready for the bite. Stories like this matter to folks like us because we know the cost of loyalty and the pain of betrayal, so stay with me because the sacrifice is over and the war is about to begin. Listen to me closely because this is the part of the story that makes your stomach turn, the kind of slow motion train wreck where you can see the disaster coming but you can't look away, because living in that basement wasn't just a change of address for Frank, it was a systematic dismantling of his dignity, a daily reminder that in the eyes of his son-in-law he had gone from being the head of a household to being a nuisance, a piece of unwanted furniture that you stick in storage and hope to forget about. The basement was finished technically, but it was cold, damp, and had that distinct smell of isolation, and every morning Frank would wake up to the sound of Mark's heavy footsteps upstairs, pacing around like he owned the world, while Frank made his coffee on a hot plate because Mark had made it clear that the gourmet kitchen upstairs was for family use, and apparently Frank didn't count as family anymore. He was just a tenant who paid his rent in blood and tears. Mark had rules, folks. Oh, yes. He had a list of rules taped to the back of the basement door like Frank was a delinquent teenager instead of a man who had paid taxes, since the Nixon administration rules like no laundry during peak hours and keep the noise down after 9 p.m. and do not park that eyesore of a truck in the driveway, because Frank's 1998 Ford F-150, the truck that had hauled the lumber to build Mark's deck, and the truck that had moved Sarah into her first dorm room, was now considered a blemish on the pristine image Mark was trying to project to the homeowners association. So Frank had to park 3 blocks away and walk in the rain just to get home, a daily walk of shame that Mark watched from the window with a smug little grin on his face. This is where most fathers would crack, where they would pack their bags and tell that boy where to stick his rules, but this man, he's playing the long game, so watch this. The invasion wasn't just physical, it was financial too, because Mark was what we call house rich and cash poor. He had the big mortgage and the leased luxury cars, but he was drowning in credit card debt trying to keep up appearances. So every month, like clockwork, he would come down to the basement with a fake smile plastered on his face and give Frank some story about a temporary cash flow issue or a surefire investment opportunity, and he would ask to borrow a few $1,000s from Frank's nest egg, and Frank knew he would never see that money again. He knew it was going into expensive dinners and designer suits, but he wrote the checks anyway because he saw the fear in Sarah's eyes. He saw how she flinched when Mark raised his voice about bills, and Frank would rather bleed his savings dry than watch his daughter cry herself to sleep over money. The disrespect ramped up when Mark started hosting dinner parties for his colleagues from the corporate office, the same office where Frank was a legend in the machine shop. But at these parties, Frank was explicitly told to stay downstairs. "We have important clients coming over, Frank," Mark would say, adjusting his silk tie. "We don't need you wandering up here in your grease-stained flannel confusing people. Just watch your TV and stay out of sight." So Frank would sit in his recliner listening to the laughter and the clinking of glasses upstairs, hearing Mark tell stories that weren't his, taking credit for work he didn't do, spinning yarns about his humble beginnings, while the man who actually lived those humble beginnings was hidden away like a dirty secret. One evening, Frank came up to the kitchen to get a glass of water because his bathroom tap was leaking and Mark had refused to fix it, and he walked right into a gathering of young executives and the room went silent. Mark turned beet red, and instead of introducing his father-in-law, the man who got him the job in the first place, he laughed nervously and said, "Sorry, everyone, this is just the maintenance guy. He's checking the pipes." And he shooed Frank away with a wave of his hand, and Frank looked at him. He looked at the man who slept next to his daughter, and he saw a soul so small it could fit through the eye of a needle, but he didn't make a scene. He just nodded slowly, turned around, and walked back down into the dark. If this disrespect makes your blood boil, you're in the right place, because arrogance like that always has a price tag, and the bill is coming due. The worst part was the way Mark started treating Frank at the plant, because as Mark climbed the ladder, he started to believe his own hype. He started to believe that he was better than the men on the floor. He stopped making eye contact with Frank in the hallways. He would walk past him with a group of suits and pretend he didn't know him. Or worse, he would make a show of disciplining Frank over minor things just to flex his authority in front of his bosses, like the time he wrote Frank up for being 2 minutes late after a snowstorm, even though Frank had been there since 4 a.m. shoveling the employee lot because the plow guy didn't show up. Mark handed him the write-up slip with a smirk and said, "Policy is policy, Frank, no special treatment for family." And Frank took the paper. He looked at the soft, uncalloused hands of his son-in-law, and he simply said, "You're right, Mark. Policy is policy. Remember that." And Mark didn't catch the tone. He didn't hear the warning in the old man's voice because he was too busy admiring his own reflection in the office window. But the guys on the floor saw it, the other machinists, the welders, the forklift drivers. They saw how Mark treated Frank, and there was a rumble starting in the factory, a quiet anger because you don't mess with a man like Frank without consequences. The final straw of the invasion came a week before the retirement party when Frank came home to find his basement tossing, turned upside-down boxes, opened papers scattered, and Mark standing there holding the deed to the old house, the one Frank had sold, the one that Mark had claimed the proceeds from to invest for the family, but really he had blown it on a bad stock tip, and he was screaming at Frank, accusing him of hiding money. "Where is it, old man?" Mark yelled, his face twisted and ugly. "I know you have a stash somewhere. Retirees always have a stash." And Frank just stood there, calm as a frozen lake, and said, "I gave you everything, Mark." And Mark spat on the floor, right on the rug Martha had knitted, and stormed out, leaving Frank standing in the wreckage of his privacy. And it was in that moment, looking at the spit on his wife's handiwork, that the sadness in Frank's heart turned into something else, something cold and hard like tempered steel. You might think the old man is helpless here, but he's about to pull a move that Mark never saw coming, so don't you dare look away. Listen to me closely. To understand the storm that was brewing inside Frank, you have to understand the silence. The basement wasn't just quiet, it was a tomb for a life that used to be full of noise. Frank sat in his worn-out leather recliner, the one with the duct tape on the armrest, staring at the ceiling while the floorboards creaked under the weight of the party upstairs. He could hear Mark's voice, booming and performative, the voice of a man who thought he had the world on a string. But down there, in the semi-darkness, Frank was having a conversation with a ghost. He looked at the photo of Martha on the nightstand, her smile frozen in time from their 25th anniversary trip to the Grand Canyon, a trip paid for with overtime shifts and skipped lunches. "Martha," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse, "I tried. I swear to you, I tried to be the bigger man." He missed her moral compass. Martha had a way of cutting through the nonsense, a way of looking at a problem and finding the kindness in it. She would have told him to forgive Mark, to pray for him, but Martha wasn't here to see the spit on her rug. She wasn't here to see her daughter Sarah shrinking into a shadow of herself. And without Martha, Frank felt the old, hard edges of his personality coming back, the edges he had smoothed over for her sake. He looked at his hands, scarred and stained with oil that had become part of his skin. These hands had built machines that powered cities. They had held newborn babies. They had carried his wife's casket. And now they were trembling, not from fear, but from a rage he had suppressed for 5 long years. It wasn't just about the money, folks. Money comes and goes. It was about the betrayal of the unspoken contract between generations. You work hard, you raise your kids right, and you expect decency. Not gratitude necessarily, just basic human decency. Mark had taken that contract, crumpled it up, and thrown it in Frank's face. The basement was filled with objects that told the story of a life Mark called nobody. A tackle box filled with lures he'd hand-painted, a framed certificate for Employee of the Month from 1989, a little wooden birdhouse Sarah had made in kindergarten, the paint chipping now. These weren't clutter or junk. They were evidence, evidence that Frank existed, evidence that he mattered. There's a reason he isn't fighting back yet, and when you find out why, it's going to hit you hard. He thought about the factory, the smell of coolant and hot metal, the way the morning light hit the dust motes dancing in the air of the machine shop. That place was his cathedral, and Mark treated it like a playground. Mark treated the men Frank had worked alongside for decades, men like Big Dave, the welder, and Silent Sam, the forklift operator, as interchangeable parts. Frank knew something Mark didn't. He knew that a company isn't the logo on the letterhead, it's the people on the floor. And he knew that Mark's arrogance was alienating the very people who made him look good. Frank closed his eyes and let the anger settle, cooling it down until it was a manageable tool, just like quenching hot steel in oil. He wasn't sad anymore. Sadness is for things you can't change. This he could change. He realized that protecting Sarah didn't mean enabling Mark anymore. Protecting Sarah meant destroying the illusion that was suffocating her. He had to break the cycle. He had to show her that the man she married was a fraud, and he had to do it in a way that she couldn't deny. He had to let the truth shine so bright it burned. He looked at the old safety goggles in his hand, the ones he would take to the party. They were scratched, ugly, and cheap, just like Mark said Frank was. But those goggles had saved his sight more than once. They were essential. Mark was about to learn the difference between what is shiny and what is real. Frank stood up, his knees popping, and walked over to a small locked metal box under his bed. He pulled a key from a hidden slit in his wallet, a place Mark had never thought to look. He unlocked the box and stared at the papers inside. Not money, not deeds, but documents, records, a journal he had kept for 35 years, noting every shift, every major decision, every safety violation he had quietly fixed to keep the plant running. And a letter from the founder of the company, Old Man Anderson himself, written 20 years ago. A letter that gave Frank a very specific kind of power. He tucked the letter into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, right next to his heart. He wasn't just the help, he was the foundation. And if you crack the foundation, the whole house comes down. Moments like this deserve to be remembered because this is the moment the victim becomes the judge. He adjusted his tie in the cracked mirror, smoothed his gray hair, and took a deep breath. "All right, Martha," he whispered. "Let's go to a party. Listen to me closely. To understand the trap Frank was about to spring, we have to go back. No dates, just the memory of a smell, acrid smoke and burning hydraulic fluid. We're in the bowels of the factory, decades ago, when Frank was in his prime and the company was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It was the middle of the night, the graveyard shift, the shift nobody wanted but Frank took because it paid $1.50 more an hour. The plant was silent except for the groaning of the big press. The Widowmaker, a machine the size of a house that stamped out the steel chassis for the trucks. The company's future rode on a massive contract that had to ship by morning. If they missed the deadline, Anderson Manufacturing was finished, and 300 families would be out on the street. The CEO, Mr. Anderson, the father of the current CEO, was down on the floor himself, sweating through his dress shirt, pacing back and forth. The Widowmaker had jammed. The main hydraulic seal had blown, and the technician said it would take 2 days to fix. 2 days they didn't have. The mood was funeral heavy. Men were looking at their boots, thinking about mortgages they couldn't pay. Anderson was sitting on a crate, head in his hands, weeping quietly. He wasn't a suit, he was a man who cared. And that's when Frank stepped up. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed his toolbox and crawled inside the machine. It was hot in there, suffocatingly hot and dangerous. If the pressure released, he'd be crushed. For 4 hours, Frank worked in a space no bigger than a coffin, bypassing the blown seal with a jury-rigged system of valves and hoses he scavenged from the scrap pile. He worked by touch, his hands burning, his lungs filling with fumes. Outside, the men waited in silence, praying, and then the hiss of pressure stabilizing, the hum of the pump. Frank crawled out, covered in black sludge, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, and simply nodded at Mr. Anderson. "Fire it up," he wheezed. The machine roared to life. The parts were stamped. The contract was met. The company was saved. That morning, as the sun came up over the smokestacks, Mr. Anderson pulled Frank into his office. He tried to write Frank a check, a big one. Frank pushed it back. "I don't need charity, sir. I need a job." Anderson looked at him, really looked at him, and pulled out a sheet of company letterhead. He wrote something down, signed it, and stamped it with his personal seal. "Frank," he said, "you saved my life's work. As long as this company stands, you have a voice in it. This isn't just a job guarantee. This is a controlling stake of moral authority. If anyone ever tries to push you out, or if the company loses its way, you bring this to the board." It was a specialized stock option, a founder's proxy, giving Frank a single, non-transferable vote equal to a board member's in times of crisis, and a protected pension that could never be touched by corporate restructuring. Frank took the paper, folded it, and put it in his safety box. He never spoke of it. He never used it. He went back to the floor and turned wrenches for another 20 years. He sacrificed everything for them. Keep listening, because that sacrifice is about to become their nightmare. He watched the company grow, watched young hotshots come and go, watched the culture shift from family to finance, but he held that paper. It was his insurance policy against exactly the kind of rot that Mark represented. Mark didn't know about the night of the fire. Mark didn't know that the current CEO, young David Anderson, had grown up hearing the story of the man in the machine from his father. Mark thought Frank was a relic. He didn't realize Frank was a legend. And that little piece of paper, yellowed with age, was sitting in Frank's pocket right now, burning a hole through the cheap fabric of his suit. It wasn't about money, it was about the power to speak and be heard. Mark had spent 5 years trying to silence Frank, trying to make him invisible. But tonight, the invisible man was going to become the most important person in the room. Tonight, the debt from that long night in the machine was finally going to be called in. If you believe respect should be mandatory, stay with this story because the bill is on the table and Mark is about to find out he can't afford it. Listen to me closely. The banquet hall was dripping with crystal and gold, the kind of place where a bottle of water costs more than an hour of labor on the assembly line, and Frank stood at the entrance feeling like he was wearing a costume because his suit, though clean and pressed, was 20 years out of style and cut from a coarser cloth than the Italian silk hugging the shoulders of the executives buzzing around the room. He walked in with his head held high, clutching that cheap plastic cup of lukewarm soda, but before he could even take a breath, Mark was on him like a hawk on a field mouse, his eyes darting around nervously to see if anyone important was watching. "Dad, what are you doing standing here?" Mark hissed, gripping Frank's elbow with a force that was supposed to be guiding but felt a lot more like restraining. "The VIPs are coming through this entrance. You need to be elsewhere." Mark steered him toward a small, wobbly table in the far back corner, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen where the servers were dumping half-eaten plates of salmon into the trash. "Sit here," Mark commanded, checking his reflection in a spoon. "And for God's sake, don't wander around. I have the CEO, David Anderson, coming in 10 minutes. I'm trying to close a massive promotion tonight, and I don't need you telling war stories about the good old days and embarrassing me. Just eat your chicken and smile." Frank looked at the table. It was the reject table, populated by a couple of interns who looked bored and an old secretary who was half asleep, and he felt a sting of humiliation that went deeper than bone. He had given 35 years to this company. He had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and school plays to keep those machines running. And at his own retirement party, he was being hidden away like a dirty secret. But he sat. He sat because he saw Sarah across the room, looking radiant but terrified, her eyes locked on Mark, trying to gauge his mood, and Frank didn't want to be the spark that set off her husband's temper. So he sat there in the shadows, watching the dog and pony show unfold. The room filled up with the smell of expensive cologne and ambition. The music started, a smooth jazz band that lacked any soul, and then the doors opened and David Anderson walked in, the CEO, the son of the man Frank had saved. David was in his 40s now, sharp, focused, a man who had inherited the empire but had kept his father's eyes, eyes that looked for truth. Mark practically sprinted across the room to greet him, his laugh too loud, his handshake too eager, a classic snake oil salesman trying to close the deal. Frank watched from his exile as Mark led David around the room, introducing him to the key players, carefully steering him away from the back corner. The son thinks he's won because he's got the suit and the smile, and the old man is in the corner, but he has no idea the hammer is about to drop, so don't go anywhere. The speeches began, and Mark, of course, grabbed the microphone first. He stood on the little stage, bathed in the spotlight, and launched into a speech that was a masterclass in stolen valor. "We are here to honor the legacy of our workforce," Mark beamed, flashing that winning smile at the crowd. "And as I look around this room, I am reminded that it is leadership, bold, visionary leadership, that guides the hands of labor. When I joined this family, I made it my mission to modernize, to streamline, to take the raw potential of the past and refine it into the profit of the future." He was taking credit. He was taking credit for the efficiency gains Frank had suggested over dinner. He was taking credit for the culture of safety Frank had built on the floor. He was erasing Frank's sweat equity and painting over it with his own corporate buzzwords. The crowd clapped politely, but the men from the floor, the few who were invited, sat with their arms crossed, stone-faced. They knew. But the breaking point, the moment the levee finally broke, came 10 minutes later. The formal speeches were over, and the room had broken into little clusters of conversation. Mark was holding court near the center, standing next to David Anderson, laughing at some joke. A young VP, new to the company, pointed toward the back corner where Frank was sitting alone, staring at his safety goggles. "Hey, Mark," the VP asked, his voice carrying over the lull in the music. "Who's the old guy in the back? The one with the safety glasses? Is that the guest of honor? Should we go say hello?" The room went quiet for a beat. Mark froze. He looked at David Anderson. Then he looked back at the VP, and a look of pure panic crossed his face. He had a choice. He could own his history. He could say, "That's my father-in-law, the man who built this place." But he didn't. Instead, he let out a dismissive little scoff, a sound of pure arrogance. "Him?" Mark said, loud enough for Frank to hear, loud enough for Sarah to hear, loud enough for the ghost of Martha to hear. "Oh, don't worry about him. He's nobody important. Just the help, basically. A relic from the old assembly line. He's probably just waiting for a handout. Ignore him. This is the turning point, folks, because you don't call a lion a house cat and expect to walk away without scratches, so don't look away now." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Nobody important. Just the help. Frank felt the blood rush to his ears, a roaring sound like a turbine spinning out of control. He looked at Sarah. She had dropped her wine glass. It shattered on the floor, red wine staining the carpet like blood, and she had her hand over her mouth, tears welling up. She looked at her father with a plea for forgiveness, but also with a terrible resignation, as if to say, "This is my life now." And that was it. That was the snap. Frank looked at the shattered glass, and he looked at Mark's smug face, and the sadness that had weighed him down for 5 years evaporated instantly. In its place was cold, hard resolve. He wasn't the help. He was the spine of this family, and the spine had just straightened up. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers brushed the textured paper of the founder's letter. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to throw a punch. He just needed to walk. Frank stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound that cut through the chatter. He didn't look at the kitchen staff. He didn't look at the interns. He fixed his eyes on David Anderson. He stepped out from the shadows of the back corner, his boots, polished but heavy, thudding against the parquet floor. Mark saw him coming. Mark's eyes widened. He stepped forward to intercept, putting a hand up like a traffic cop. "Frank, sit down," Mark hissed under his breath, stepping in Frank's path. "What do you think you're doing? You're embarrassing me." Frank didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He looked Mark dead in the eye, a look of such intense, quiet authority that Mark involuntarily took a step back. "Get out of my way, son," Frank said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Mark's chest. "I'm done sitting in the dark." He brushed past Mark like he was a cobweb and walked straight into the circle of light where the CEO stood. The room fell silent. Everyone was watching the nobody now. Frank stopped 3 feet from David Anderson. David looked at the old man, looked at the weathered face, the scars, the cheap suit, and then his eyes drifted down to the safety goggles in Frank's hand. A spark of recognition flickered in the CEO's eyes. Frank reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the folded, yellowed letter, and held it out. "Hello, David," Frank said, his voice clear and steady. "Your father told me to give you this if the company ever lost its way. I think it's time you read it. The son thinks he's won. He has no idea the hammer's about to drop, so don't go anywhere. Listen to me closely, because the air in that banquet hall didn't just get quiet, it got vacuum sealed, the kind of silence that hurts your ears, like when you're deep underwater and the pressure is building against your skull." When Frank handed that yellowed envelope to David Anderson, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, and you could hear the ice melting in the glasses on the tables because everyone from the waiters to the board members knew they were witnessing something dangerous, something that wasn't on the schedule. Mark stood there, frozen, his hand half extended as if he was trying to cast a spell to make the old man disappear, but the spell was broken and the reality was crashing in. He looked like a deer in the headlights, a man who had built a castle on sand and was just now feeling the tide come in. David Anderson took the envelope, and for a second he just stared at the handwriting on the front, and I saw his eyes widen just a fraction, because a son knows his father's handwriting just like a mechanic knows the sound of his own engine, and that scrawl was unmistakable. It was the penmanship of the old lion, the founder, the man whose portrait hung in the lobby. David looked at Frank, and then he looked at Mark, and then he looked back at the envelope, and his fingers trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal which had cracked with age, sending a tiny shower of red dust onto the pristine white tablecloth. Mark, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, tried one last desperate Hail Mary to salvage the situation, and he stepped forward with that oily smile of his, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. "David, really, I must apologize. This is my father-in-law. He's been confused lately," Mark said, tapping his temple significantly as if to imply Frank was losing his marbles. "He has these delusions of grandeur, probably wrote that himself in the basement. Let me just take that, and we can get back to the celebration of actual leadership." Mark reached out to snatch the letter from the CEO's hand, and folks, that was the moment he signed his own death warrant because David Anderson didn't just pull the letter away, he snapped his head up and looked at Mark with a gaze that could have cut glass. "Don't you touch this," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know this seal, and I know this paper." Mark recoiled as if he'd been slapped, and he took a step back, his face draining of color because he realized he had just tried to grab a holy relic from the Pope. "I told you justice was coming, so watch the look on that ungrateful face because the trap is about to snap shut." David unfolded the letter and the paper crinkled loudly in the silent room, a sound that echoed like a gunshot. He began to read silently, his lips moving slightly, and as he read his expression changed from curiosity to shock and then to a deep, profound reverence. He looked up at Frank, and for the first time in the entire night, the CEO of a billion-dollar company looked small. He looked like a boy again standing in the shadow of a giant. "Is it true?" David asked Frank, ignoring Mark completely. "Are you the one, the midnight machinist, the one my father called the Iron Savior?" Frank just nodded slowly, his face like granite. "I did what had to be done, David, just like your father did." Mark let out a scoff, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "The Iron Savior? Please. He's a tool pusher, David. He changed oil. He's nobody." And that's when David Anderson turned on Mark and folks. "I have seen men get fired. I have seen men get evicted, but I have never seen a man get dismantled like this." David held up the letter for the room to see. "You called him nobody," David said, his voice rising, projecting to the back of the room where the kitchen staff had stopped working to watch. "You called him the help. Well, listen to what my father, the man who built the chair you're so desperate to sit in, had to say about this nobody." David began to read aloud, and his voice shook with emotion. "To my son David. If you are reading this, it means the company has lost its way or I am gone. The man holding this letter is not just an employee. On the night of November 14th, 1998, he crawled into the Widowmaker press when everyone else ran away. He risked his life to save this company from bankruptcy. He asked for no glory. He asked for no money. He asked only for work. Therefore, let it be known that this man holds the founder's proxy. In matters of ethical conduct and leadership integrity, his voice carries the weight of my own. He is the conscience of Anderson Manufacturing. If he speaks, you listen. If he condemns, you act." The room erupted in a gasp that sucked the oxygen right out of the air. It was a blindside hit, a total knockout. Mark's mouth fell open, and he looked around the room looking for an ally, looking for someone to laugh with him, to tell him it was a prank, but nobody was laughing. The board members were looking at Frank with wide eyes, realizing that the maintenance guy they had ignored all night technically outranked them in moral authority. The founder's proxy was a legendary clause, a myth in the corporate bylaws that nobody thought actually existed, but here it was real and terrifying. If you live for moments where arrogance meets reality, this is why you're here, because Mark is realizing he's been bullying the boss. But Frank wasn't done. The letter was the shield, but now he needed the sword. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out the small black notebook, the journal he had kept for years. "This letter says I have a voice," Frank said, his voice rough and authentic, cutting through the polish of the room, "and I'm using it. You want to talk about modernizing the company, Mark? You want to talk about efficiency? Let's talk about why you moved the supplier contracts to a shell company in Nevada." Frank opened the notebook. August 12th. Mark directs procurement to bypass quality checks on steel bolts. September 4th. Mark fires 3 safety inspectors who flagged the issue. October 20th. Mark buys a new boat. Frank looked up from the book and stared straight at his son-in-law. "I didn't just mop the floors, Mark. I listened. I watched. You think because I have grease on my hands I can't read a ledger? You think because I live in your basement I don't hear you bragging on the phone?" Mark was trembling now, visible shaking. That's illegal," Mark stammered. pointing a shaking finger at the notebook. "That's private information. You were spying on me. I was protecting the company," Frank roared, and the sound of his voice made the crystal glasses rattle. "I was protecting the legacy of the man who gave me a job when I had nothing, and I was protecting my daughter from a fraud." Sarah, standing a few feet away, let out a sob. She looked at her husband, the man who had belittled her father for years, and she saw him for what he was, a snake in the grass who had been caught. The CEO, David Anderson, walked over to Frank and took the notebook. He flipped through a few pages, his face darkening with every line he read. He saw the dates. He saw the details. It was forensic evidence of embezzlement and gross negligence, recorded by the most reliable witness in the building. David closed the book with a snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. He turned to Mark. "You told me you increased margins by 20%. David said, his voice icy calm. "But it looks like you just cut safety protocols and pocketed the difference. You compromised the integrity of my father's machines, and you disrespected the man who saved them." Mark looked for an exit, but the security guards, big guys who knew Frank, guys Frank had bought coffee for 100 times, had quietly moved to block the doors. They weren't looking at Mark like an executive anymore. They were looking at him like a trespasser. "David, please," Mark begged, the sweat pouring down his face, ruining his expensive spray tan. "We can explain this. It's just creative accounting. It's standard practice. Don't listen to him. He's just a bitter old man." "He is the founder's proxy," David said, finalizing the trap. "And effective immediately, he is your superior in this review. Frank?" David turned to the old man. "What is your recommendation?" The room went deadly silent. Frank looked at Mark. He looked at the man who had called him nobody. He looked at the man who had made him eat in the garage. He could have been cruel. He could have shouted. But Frank was a professional. "He's a safety hazard, David," Frank said simply, using the terminology of the shop floor. "And when a part is defective, you don't fix it. You scrap it. I told you justice was coming. Watch the look on that ungrateful face." The CEO nodded. "You heard him. Get him out of here." Two security guards stepped forward, grabbed Mark by his expensive Italian suit jacket, and hauled him toward the exit. He was kicking and screaming, shouting about lawsuits, shouting about his rights, but nobody was listening. He was dragged past the tables, past the colleagues he tried to impress, past the help he had insulted. And as he was dragged past Frank, he looked into the old man's eyes and saw nothing but absolute, unyielding iron. Frank didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just put his safety goggles back in his pocket. The trap had sprung. The pest was removed, and the lion was finally awake. If this lesson means something to you, pass it on, because the reckoning isn't over yet. We still have to settle the score at home. Listen to me closely, because while the fireworks show, the real explosion happened when the smoke cleared and the cold, hard reality of the morning after set in. You see, folks, the thing about a man like Mark is that he builds his life on a foundation of lies, and when you pull one brick, the whole house of cards doesn't just fall, it disintegrates into dust. The ride home from the banquet hall was silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, like the air before a tornado touches down. Frank drove his old F-150, the one Mark had banned from the driveway, and Sarah sat in the passenger seat clutching her purse, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, her mascara running down her cheeks, but her jaw set tight for the first time in years. They pulled up to the McMansion, the house that was supposed to be the symbol of Mark's success, but was really just a monument to his debt, and they saw the lights blazing in every room. Mark had taken a cab home after being thrown out by security, and he was in a frenzy. When Frank and Sarah walked through the front door, the place looked like a hurricane had hit it. Mark was running around frantic, pulling drawers open, shredding papers, stuffing clothes into Louis Vuitton duffel bags, trying to salvage whatever he could before the inevitable legal tsunami hit. He looked up when they entered, and for a second he tried to put the mask back on. He tried to find that arrogance that had served him so well, but it was gone, replaced by the desperate sweat of a man who knows the sheriff is coming. Sarah, baby, listen to me, Mark stammered, walking over with his hands out. That old man is crazy. He tricked David. He cooked up those books. I'm going to sue them for defamation. We just need to leave. We need to go to the Cayman Islands for a bit. Until this blows over, pack your things. He tried to grab her arm, but Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She just looked at him with eyes that were dry and cold. Frank stepped forward, closing the front door with a heavy thud that sounded like a prison cell slamming shut. You aren't going anywhere, Mark, Frank said, his voice calm and terrifyingly level. And neither is she. Frank walked over to the dining room table and dropped a thick manila envelope on the polished wood. It wasn't the journal this time. It was the receipts. You see, while Mark was playing executive at the party, Frank had been busy with the company's forensic accountants who had been working remotely the second David Anderson saw that journal. He could have saved them, but instead he let them fall, and that is true justice. So watch this, because the bill is finally due. What is this? Mark asked, staring at the envelope like it was a bomb. That, Frank said, leaning on the table with his calloused hands, is the reckoning. It's the audit trail of the last 5 years. It's the second mortgage you took out on this house without Sarah's signature by forging her name. It's the credit cards you opened in my name, and it's the text messages. Mark turned pale. Text messages? Oh, yes, Frank continued, enjoying the look of absolute terror on the younger man's face. The company phone you used, the one you thought was private, it belongs to Anderson Manufacturing, and when you get fired for cause, they dump the data. Frank reached into the envelope and pulled out a stack of printed transcripts. He handed them to Sarah. Read them, honey, Frank said softly. Sarah took the papers. Her hands shook as she read. They were messages between Mark and his buddies in finance, messages mocking Frank, calling him a senile old goat, messages mocking Sarah, calling her the cash cow and clueless, messages bragging about how he was going to dump her as soon as he cashed out the stock options. Sarah read one line out loud, her voice trembling, waiting for the old man to kick the bucket so we can sell the land. She looked up at Mark, and the sadness in her eyes vanished, replaced by a fire that Frank hadn't seen since she was a teenager. You bet on my father dying, she whispered. You bet on the man who fed us, the man who saved you. Mark started to backpedal. Sarah, it's just locker room talk. It doesn't mean anything. I love you. If this lesson means something to you, pass it on, because we are about to see the moment a bully gets broken. Stop, Sarah said. She reached down to her left hand and struggled for a second with her wedding ring. It was a big, flashy diamond, the one Mark had insisted on to show off his status. She yanked it off her finger, scratching her skin in the process, and threw it at him. It hit him in the chest and bounced onto the floor with a hollow clink. Get out, she said. Get out of my house. Mark laughed a hysterical, broken laugh. Your house? This is my house. My name is on the deed. You can't kick me out. Frank stepped in. Then he stepped right into Mark's personal space, towering over him. Actually, Mark, that's the funny part, Frank said, a grim smile touching his lips. See that second mortgage you forged? That's bank fraud, federal crime, and because you used company funds to pay the initial down payment, the assets are frozen pending the investigation. But the bank? I know the bank manager. I fixed his furnace in '89. He called me an hour ago. They are calling the loan, Mark, tonight. And since you can't pay it, they were going to foreclose. Frank paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. But I didn't let them. I bought the debt. I used my pension. I used the buyout David Anderson just offered me for my patent rights on the machine fix. I own the note, Mark. I own the debt. And I am foreclosing on you. Mark's knees actually buckled. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor surrounded by his half-packed bags. He was the king of the castle 5 hours ago, and now he was a squatter. You can't do this, Mark whimpered, crying now real ugly tears of self-pity. I have nowhere to go. My accounts are frozen. They took my company car. Frank looked down at him and didn't feel a shred of pity, only the satisfaction of a job well done. "You have your feet, don't you?" Frank said. "You have those soft hands? Maybe you can find some sweat equity out there on the street, but you aren't finding it here." The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder. Frank checked his watch. "That would be the police," Frank said, checking his watch. "David Anderson pressed charges for the embezzlement, and I pressed charges for the forgery. You're not leaving in a taxi, Mark. You're leaving in cuffs." Mark looked at Sarah one last time, begging with his eyes, but she had turned her back on him and was hugging her father, her head buried in Frank's chest, sobbing the tears of someone who has finally woken up from a nightmare. The police knocked on the door, sharp, authoritative raps. Frank opened it. He didn't say much, he just pointed to the man on the floor. As they handcuffed Mark and dragged him out past the neighbors who had gathered on their lawns to watch the spectacle, Mark screamed and cursed, blaming everyone but himself. "I'm important, I'm an executive," he yelled as they shoved him into the back of the cruiser. Frank stood on the porch, arm around his daughter, watching the flashing lights fade into the darkness. He looked at the driveway where his old truck was parked, proud and defiant. He looked at the house, which was now silent and safe. Mark was gone. The parasite had been removed. And for the first time in 5 years, the air tasted sweet. Frank looked at Sarah and squeezed her shoulder. "He said I was nobody," Frank whispered, "but nobody just took him down." If you believe that karma always pays the piper, then you know this story ended exactly how it had to. Listen to me closely. Family isn't about whose blood runs in your veins, and it certainly isn't about who marries into the clan. Family is about who stands by you when the storm hits. It's about who respects the calluses on your hands and the sacrifices in your past. Mark thought he could buy respect with a suit and a title, but he learned the hard way that you can't cheat the universe. You can't treat the people who built your foundation like dirt and expect the house to stand. Frank and Sarah moved out of that McMansion. They sold it, paid off the debts, and bought a nice piece of land near the lake, the kind of place Martha would have loved. Frank got his fishing boat. Sarah went back to school. And Mark? Last I heard, he was working the counter at a rental car kiosk, telling anyone who would listen about how he used to be a CEO. But nobody listens, because character is currency, folks, and he's bankrupt. Take care of your own, respect your elders, and never ever underestimate a man with dirty hands and a clean conscience. Join our family, subscribe. Listen to me closely, because while the party was the fireworks show, the real explosion happened when the smoke cleared and the cold, hard reality of the morning after set in. You see, folks, the thing about a man like Mark is that he builds his life on a foundation of lies, and when you pull one brick, the whole house of cards doesn't just fall, it disintegrates into dust. The ride home from the banquet hall was silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, like the air before a tornado touches down. Frank drove his old F-150, the one Mark had banned from the driveway, and Sarah sat in the passenger seat, clutching her purse, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, her mascara running down her cheeks, but her jaw set tight for the first time in years. They pulled up to the McMansion, the house that was supposed to be the symbol of Mark's success, but was really just a monument to his debt, and they saw the lights blazing in every room. Mark had taken a cab home after being thrown out by security, and he was in a frenzy. When Frank and Sarah walked through the front door, the place looked like a hurricane had hit it. Mark was running around frantic, pulling drawers open, shredding papers, stuffing clothes into Louis Vuitton duffel bags, trying to salvage whatever he could before the inevitable legal tsunami hit. He looked up when they entered, and for a second he tried to put the mask back on. He tried to find that arrogance that had served him so well, but it was gone, replaced by the desperate sweat of a man who knows the sheriff is coming. "Sarah, baby, listen to me," Mark stammered, walking over with his hands out. "That old man is crazy. He tricked David. He cooked up those books. I'm going to sue them for defamation. We just need to leave. We need to go to the Cayman Islands for a bit. Until this blows over, pack your things." He tried to grab her arm, but Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She just looked at him with eyes that were dry and cold. Frank stepped forward, closing the front door with a heavy thud that sounded like a prison cell slamming shut. "You aren't going anywhere, Mark," Frank said, his voice calm and terrifyingly level. "And neither is she." Frank walked over to the dining room table and dropped a thick manila envelope on the polished wood. It wasn't the journal this time. It was the receipts. You see, while Mark was playing executive at the party, Frank had been busy with the company's forensic accountants who had been working remotely the second David Anderson saw that journal. He could have saved them, but instead he let them fall, and that is true justice. So watch this, because the bill is finally due. "What is this?" Mark asked, staring at the envelope like it was a bomb. "That," Frank said, leaning on the table with his calloused hands, "is the reckoning. It's the audit trail of the last 5 years. It's the second mortgage you took out on this house without Sarah's signature by forging her name. It's the credit card